And we're back in the car like we never left. Welcome to the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your, once again, very, very chilly evening here in New York. But we're going to skip past all that promotional jazz and get right to the guts of the episode. Today, December 23rd, marks the 25th anniversary of the release of a movie that might actually be in my top 10 favorite movies of all time. There are two movies with this particular star as the central figure in the lead role that might make my top 10. One of them for sure. The star is Jim Carrey. The other movie is The Truman Show. But celebrating its 25th anniversary today is Milos Forman's vastly underrated, underappreciated, slept on masterpiece, which I think a lot of critics who should know better completely missed the boat on, misread, misunderstood everything. Man on the Moon. Now, the movie Man on the Moon, for those who don't know, is about a Long Island, came from Great Neck. He was known as a comedian, but he was not really a comedian. He liked to call himself a song and dance man. But his name is Andy Kaufman, and he was, we can consider now, that he was Sacha Baron Cohen before Sacha Baron Cohen. He was a performance artist. But unlike Sacha Baron Cohen, who has had different characters, some of whom were more provocative than others, some of whom were more into what we could call audience alienation than others, and Sacha Baron Cohen can be Sacha Baron Cohen. He can slip in and out of character, and he has given a lot of interviews, as we know, where he is himself. He's not playing the character of Ali G or Borat or any of the other, Talladega Nights, the character he played with Will Ferrell in that movie where he was a Scream. Andy Kaufman was an original. And one of the criticisms levied at this movie is that we don't really ever understand Andy Kaufman fully. What other people consider to be a weakness, I consider a strength. I believe that Andy Kaufman was a bit of a cipher. He was an unknowable person because I don't think he even had himself figured out. I feel like that was part of the point of his existence, was that everything was part of the act, but the act never stopped. I remember reading a story of somebody, I don't think it was a friend, but it was an acquaintance of someone I knew. And his family was friends with Andy Kaufman's family, his father, whatever. And after Andy blew up and he had been on Taxi, he happened to come home for the holidays one year. And these friends of his parents invited the Kaufman family over, and you might have expected, because Andy was already the big TV star, he had broken into movies. I think he had just made the film Heart Beeps with Bernadette Peters. That was a very unconventional, it was a really interesting film, but it bombed. And Andy Kaufman decided, you know what, I'll go to this Christmas gathering. And the person telling the story said that he was very quiet. They were expecting the life of the party. Maybe they were expecting fireworks, that he was going to deliberately be an asshole. He was very quiet, but he did not eat any of the food that was being served. He asked if he could just have some peanut butter and some bread, and he would make his own peanut butter sandwiches. And that was it. He was perfectly happy doing his own thing, marching to his own tune. And there is an old saying that you can tell the trailblazer because he's the one who's got all the arrows in his back. Well, in the case of Andy Kaufman, he didn't necessarily have arrows in his back, but he did burn a lot of bridges, and he rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. And it's something that, as his life went forth, and as he got older, he didn't really get to be very old. He was in his 30s, but he began to kind of not so much see the error of his ways, but he seemed to have a turn towards more conventional interaction with other people. And there has been a lot of controversy over Jim Carrey's performance in this film. To me, it is touched by genius. It is a performance that can only be given by somebody, I believe, who has had his own struggles. And Jim Carrey, a number of years ago, told the truth about his lifelong depression. And he didn't need to talk about him wanting to kill himself. The understanding was that despite his stupendous successes, the first guy to get a $20 million guaranteed paycheck, beloved around the world as a funny man, he was miserable. And I don't think that Andy Kaufman was necessarily tortured. He just was different. He was wired in a way unlike pretty much anyone else. I can't think of anybody from Robin Williams on down, or Sacha Baron Cohen, who does not seem tortured when he isn't working. Andy Kaufman was just an unusual individual, an outlier in a world of outliers and in a business of outliers, of people, it's Hollywood, it's showbiz. That's just how they are out there. But Man on the Moon takes this very complicated individual, and it's not so much, and this is where I feel like a lot of critics just completely missed what was going on there. It's not that Milos Forman is trying to make sense of Andy Kaufman's life. You can't make sense of Andy Kaufman's life. That's the point. That's the idea. And it frustrated critics. And maybe the first time I saw the movie, I was a little disappointed that it didn't go deeper into the character, the real life Andy Kaufman. But if he didn't know who he was, well, how the fuck can we ever know who he really was? But what we're left with is somebody who was so distinctive and so unforgettable in his approach. Now, there hadn't been anybody, and there still isn't anybody, whose only goal was to get a reaction. If he made people laugh, if he made people happy, okay. But he seemed to get just as much of a thrill out of enraging people. And that is very antisocial. And when you think about show business, being antisocial is not really the way to be successful. It's not the way to be successful in Hollywood or in the world of professional wrestling. But Andy Kaufman was successful on TV, he was successful in Hollywood, and he was successful in professional wrestling because he was, as I said, an outlier. There was something so unique about him that even if you hated his guts, you kept watching. And this is the thing, the professional wrestling angle from a symbolic perspective. Why do people ever root for the bad guy? Why are bad guy wrestlers often so popular? And ironically, this is something that kind of turned as the years and long after Andy Kaufman, the real Andy Kaufman, was gone, where you had organizations such as the WWF and then the WWE crafting storylines where certain wrestlers were supposed to be what they call heels, meaning they're bad guy wrestlers and the fans are not supposed to cheer for them. But what do you do if the fans just decide to root for the bad guy? There were a lot of people, as much as Andy Kaufman in the wrestling world, because a lot of people thought it was real, he was despised. But there were a lot of people who just got a kick out of it, said, this guy is such a clown. He's so, if you'll excuse the phrase, he's so over the top that it's somehow almost endearing. Because when he gets in there with guys twice his size, it's going to beat the shit out of him. And he's still insulting and doing the whole thing. The movie is incredible. Yes, it is little more than a series of strung together vignettes with Jim Carrey acting many very important real-life moments, movie moments, TV moments of Andy Kaufman's life. But every single scene in this film is just, it's masterclass in film acting from Jim Carrey, and it's a masterclass in direction from Milos Forman. Now, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, some of you know it, won all the major Oscars, and Amadeus is an extraordinary film. That wouldn't be in my top 10. It would be in my top 25, though. But this, to me, is Milos's best film. This is his most compulsively rewatchable film, and without spoiling it, this is top 5 greatest endings I've ever seen. The movie doesn't seem to be building to this ending, but when it's over and we get to see where the fuck was Paul Giamatti's Oscar nomination, by the way, as Andy Kaufman's real-life best friend and writing partner, Bob Zmuda. Giamatti, it's incredible how good Giamatti is in this film. The only little tidbit I'll give you, the end of this movie, is there's a moment where Paul Giamatti starts crying, and we as the audience don't understand how he can be standing literally where he's standing in the frame. It doesn't make sense. Giamatti crying it's just a moment of sublime beauty. And it elevates the film to the exalted level of, we have seen something we've never seen before about somebody we're never going to see again. Everything works. And another element that was discussed at the time the film came out, and this is not an incorrect thing. Courtney Love had done great work in his previous film, People vs. Larry Flint. I think that she got a supporting actress nomination in that. And Woody Harrelson got a best actor nomination. People vs. Larry Flint, unbelievable. Edward Norton had that huge breakout year in 96. He has a good role in Woody Allen's Everyone Says I Love You, and Primal Fear. I think he got an Oscar nomination for supporting actor. He pretty much steals the movie from Laura Linney and Richard Gere. And People vs. Larry Flint. What did he play? Alan Isaacman, the attorney, I think was his name. But her role in Man on the Moon is not as good, it's not as juicy of a role, and she doesn't really get to stretch very much. The film stays focused on Andy Kaufman as he goes through the highs and lows of Hollywood. And the irony, he was an incredible sitcom performer. He played two characters on Taxi. He played, Nicky Ferranti and Latka Gravas. And Jim he channels Andy Kaufman, and this is where there are people still debating his performance. The documentary that Netflix aired, I want to say it was about 5 years ago, Jim and Andy, it shows that Jim was disruptive. There were reports coming out of the set, and I remember reading this, circa 1998, that Jim Carrey that they didn't know what was going on. Was he having a mental breakdown, or was he so deep in character that he was having trouble coming out? There was reports of a brawl with Jerry Lawler, that's the famous wrestler that the real Andy Kaufman was friends with, and they created this entire storyline that they were arch enemies. Again, it was absurd because Jerry Lawler was a fucking huge man who, if he wrestled or fought Andy Kaufman for real, he would squash him like a grasshopper. But all of these reports came out of the set as the movie was being made. And naturally, the studio said, we categorically deny these baseless accusations. Jim is a consummate professional. There was no brawl. There were scenes of wrestling, and I think that people are just making shit up. There was all of this deny. Well, Jim and Andy, the documentary, shows and explains it was all true. And Jim cops to it. He said, I was doing what I thought I had to do to be the best and do the best and give the best performance. I didn't want people to call me Jim on set. I wanted people to call me Andy, even if I was just getting makeup applied in the trailer. And Jim, very soft-spoken. But he was disruptive. And the real Jerry Lawler wanted to kill him because he was just acting like such an ass. He thought making the real Jerry Lawler angry was going to work for the film, and I don't think it was necessary. I mean, Jerry Lawler was basically an actor as a wrestler anyway, right? Think about it. So all the stories were true. And you ask yourself, well, was it worth it? And in this instance, for the sake of great art, as long as Jim Carrey was okay with it, I think it was worth it. Because the flip side is that people involved in the film, such as Danny DeVito, said, the people who knew the real Andy Kaufman and were close with him as DeVito was, although DeVito does not play Louis De Palma, the character from Taxi, that was a little weird. He plays George Shapiro, who was Andy Kaufman's agent in real life and kind of discovered him. But Danny DeVito said, it felt like Andy was back every day of shooting. Jim sounded like him. His mannerisms were spot on. It was almost as if the spirit of Andy was in him, was with him. And the way that people who were close to the real Andy Kaufman, like Bob Zmuda, who he doesn't play himself, he plays a character in the movie. I think he was supposed to be one of the producers of a TV show called Fridays that Andy Kaufman famously fucked up on purpose. And the real Bob Zmuda, like, they start fighting. It's actually really funny in the world of Man on the Moon. But people who knew him, his girlfriend, who was his girlfriend when he passed in real life, Lynn Margulies, she saw it as an enormous blessing that Jim did what he did. She said very similar to what DeVito said, and the real Bob Zmuda said it as well. This is in a featurette that's on the DVD of Man on the Moon. It felt like Andy was back. And there have been a lot of wacky conspiracy theories. There are plenty of people that, for even when the film came out, he had been gone. Kaufman, spoiler alert, the real Andy Kaufman was only 34 when he died. He died of lung cancer, and he didn't really smoke. He smoked when he was playing one of his characters, the alter ego, if you will, Tony Clifton. But there were people that thought that Andy Kaufman, because he'd always talked about faking his own death, that he actually had faked his own death. And there was a fairy tale fantasy that the real Andy Kaufman was going to emerge from like a Bobby Fischer, even deeper, because there were a couple of years where nobody knew where the hell on the planet Earth Bobby Fischer was. But there was a hope that when that movie came out, well, maybe Andy really did fake his own death and he's going to make a big reappearance. But he really did die of lung cancer, which must have just been a terrible genetic situation because he didn't smoke. He was a healthful person. He ate a macrobiotic diet before that was even a thing. He was into yoga and transcendental meditation for all of the craziness of his act and some of the things that he pulled. The movie it's just so well done, and there are so many incredible scenes. And the way that Jim is able to move back and forth between Andy, because Andy at any given time is coming across sometimes as a heel, sometimes as decent and kind, but you never know which version you're getting. His alter ego, the character, the kind of obnoxious lounge singer, Tony Clifton. Tony Clifton he's always an asshole. That's his shtick. He is just an awful guy, insulting to everyone. The hair is terrible, the mustache, the way that he speaks, he's so crude. But it's all in Carrey's performance. And for the second consecutive year, Jim won a Golden Globe, but was not nominated for Oscar. Now, I love his performance in The Truman Show. I think that he's better in Man on the Moon because the artifice never shows through. He's so committed to the role. It felt like this was the role he was born to play. Even though Milos Forman talked about it, he nearly cast Edward Norton. He felt that Edward Norton had the mannerisms and the speech patterns just about as well as Jim. The studio, though, because Milos really wasn't sure, but the studio wanted Jim Carrey because he's a bigger draw, and they thought that the film was going to be very successful. And it didn't do well at the box office. And that was surprising to certain people, but the trailer, it sent out too many mixed signals, and it's to the studio's credit that they did not sell it as another wacky Jim Carrey comedy, because they had gotten burned, in the case of, I think it was Paramount, with The Cable Guy in 1996, which they tried to market as if it was maybe slightly darker, but it was basically Jim Carrey doing wacky things. Yeah, it's Jim Carrey doing wacky things, but his character is a sociopath, and he's fucking off his rocker. And it's not a conventional Jim Carrey comedy. His next movie, Me, Myself, and Irene, was. That was a fall-down funny, gross out humor, etc., etc. Man on the Moon is a movie that I have seen beginning to end at least 15 times. I've probably seen The Truman Show start to finish closer to 10. But there is something magical about every scene in this film. Even though, yes, it does have the feel of a series of vignettes, one after another. It all works. And yeah, it's fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, but the score is way too low. And I feel like there will come a point in time where this movie is reappraised, where people say, as biopics go, this is about as good as you can do it. Because we don't have all the answers to life. That's the thing. We don't know everything. And I remember the movie Solaris, which is science fiction, but there was a concept which I think applies here, where when you see someone, you're not seeing them as they actually are. You're seeing them through whatever your perception of them is. Andy Kaufman was not a knowable commodity. It was whatever we brought to it, whatever we thought of him. He was just like he was a blank slate. He was a Rorschach test in human form. What did you think of Andy Kaufman? And there were those moments, and this is represented in the film, not that he went too far, but where he thought that he could pull gags for longer than he actually could. Like when he famously, this was after he got involved with the wrestling, which legitimately turned a lot of people off. They thought it was absurd and that he shouldn't have done it. And but people also didn't know that the whole thing was a work, that he wasn't really serious, and everybody was kind of in on the gag. But on Saturday Night Live, they actually did something interactive a decade and a half before the internet, where they took a poll. I don't know if it was, I think it was a telephone poll, I think. I'm not 100% if it was a telephone or like a newspaper kind of a poll. But they did a poll. Do you want to have Andy? Because he was not part of the cast, but he was a relatively frequent guest. Not even a guest host, but he would just appear on the show, would be more accurate. And they did would you want him on the show, or should we just not invite him back? And the fans did not want him back. And there's a moment in the movie where Jim, as Andy, doesn't really react terribly. He thinks it's pretty funny that these people took the wrestling thing so seriously, they don't even want me back on the show. And then he says words to the effect of, I should just go back on and say that I demand a recount. The judging was rigged, or something like that. But it's on Danny DeVito as George Shapiro to point out to him, Andy, I really feel weird telling you this, but they don't want you back. And the look on Jim Carrey's face, it's almost as if he had never considered that them saying they didn't want him back actually meant that they didn't want him back. And it's one of the moments in the film where he begins to maybe look at the world a little bit differently. That maybe it's okay to do your best to try to spread cheer and spread joy. And at the beginning of the movie, Jim Carrey does the Latka Gravis, that's the character from Taxi, impression, I should say. And he talks about the fact that the movie is not really that good. All of the events in my life are chopped up and mixed around for dramatic purposes. And he goes into this spiel. Well, in real life, Andy Kaufman gave a concert at Carnegie Hall, which some people didn't like, but other people felt was magic. Where he had Santa Claus, he had the Rockettes, and a lot of people really loved it. And at the end of the show, he took the audience out literally for milk and cookies. In the world of the movie, they mix up the timeline. And the Carnegie Hall concert, be it something that he's wanted to do since the beginning of his career, is play Carnegie Hall. The Carnegie Hall concert comes after he is very sick, and he probably doesn't have very much time to live. The way that Jim reacts at the end of this sequence, where he doesn't want to tear up, but he can't help it, because his dream of not only playing Carnegie Hall, but crushing it and making a ton of people really, really happy, coming across like a real mensch. It turns out that maybe that's what he was trying to do all along, and he had to go through all of the other rigmarole to reach a point where he didn't have to be a contentious, he didn't have to be this angry performance artist, he did not have to engage in audience alienation tactics. he started to care that they were having a good reaction and not a negative one. If we could relitigate the 1999 or the 2000 Oscars, if you ask me, do I think that Kevin Spacey gives a better performance in American Beauty than Jim Carrey in Man on the Moon? No, I don't, quite frankly. Now, 99 was an incredible year for movies, we know that. But Spacey's character is a sad sack at the beginning of the movie, and he's a sad sack at the end of the movie. It's not that it's a one-note performance. I just don't think the character of Lester Burnham is that interesting, at least as presented. And I've always thought American Beauty was vastly overrated. It's a good movie. I don't think Sam Mendes is capable of making a bad movie. The guy is brilliant. I love Road to Perdition. American Beauty to me is 3 stars out of 4. But I've said this before. Annette Bening is the only one who played the movie correctly. It was a black comedy. She played it like a black comedy. Everybody else played it like a Bergman film. It just threw it out of whack for me. It didn't work. I'm upset that John Travolta won a Globe in 1995 and wasn't nominated for Oscar. I thought he should have won Best Actor for Get Shorty. No offense to Nicolas Cage in Leaving Las Vegas. And Jim should have at least gotten the courtesy of a Best Actor nomination for Man on the Moon. He is sensational. And it's incredible to think with all the successes that he had when he burst on the scene with Ace Ventura, with The Mask, with Dumb and Dumber, with Ace Ventura 2, which was a huge hit, with Batman Forever, which was an astronomically huge hit. The fact that his best was still to come. The Truman Show in 98 with Peter Weir. Man on the Moon with Milos Forman in 99. What a run. 5 incredible years. And that's even including the disappointment of the Cable Guy, but he's phenomenal in that movie. Man on the Moon, though, is a film that if you haven't seen it, I will go down on the hill that you will really like it. Whether or not you're a big fan of Jim Carrey, whether or not you've even heard of Andy Kaufman, because if you're under 35, it's very likely you don't, if maybe you've heard the name, you don't know much about him unless you've seen this movie, because he has been gone for 4 decades. Man, it's a long time. But Man on the Moon, easily among my top 10 favorite movies of all time. A brilliant film, misunderstood, underappreciated, underrated, hopefully will be revisited and reappraised as the years go by. This has been episode 390 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for spending some of your very chilly Monday evening here with me in New York. If you check out this episode on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, share, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch this episode on the audio platforms such as Podbean, Spotify, iTunes, or the others in which we're hosted, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, share, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with a new episode real soon. Till then, thank you very much. Peace.